Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today. I'd like to go ahead and get started. If you have any questions, just let me know and we'll be able to address them at the end. So this conversation is going to answer a few questions and maybe bring a couple more. But we're going to be looking at radio frequencies and their impact on surveillance, tracking, and everything like that. While researching this topic, the area of 5G came up a lot. So we're going to address that in the second part of the presentation and talk about it a little bit. And at the end, discuss what you can do. And I apologize. I know I'm fading in and out of existence here, but it should be okay. So let's talk about radio frequencies, or RF. What is RF? RF is the part of the electromagnetic spectrum for a wide range of purposes, particularly for us, communication and broadcasting purposes. Antennas generate these electromagnetic oscillations, also known as RF waves. And this fluctuates the electronic signal, which allows us to bring audio, data, and other forms of information with it. We have unintentional interference and intentional interference, and the intentional is how we get our data and information across. There are many different bands of the radio frequencies. So these are the different spectrum bands, and we'll go into which devices fall within which spectrum and how that looks in a little bit. But we have a range from very low frequency all the way to extremely high frequency. Some of these frequencies have their own names and categorizations, and they relate to what types of communications can happen in each spectrum. So I have a couple of examples here. And one thing I want to point out is the bottom line. This will become a really important conversation when we get to 5G. But we have non-ionizing and ionizing radiation that comes out of these radio frequencies. So what is a radio frequency? Well, you can see here on the chart, there are these waves that go up and down. Those are our waves in RF, and the distance between them is known as a wavelength. The wavelength is inversely proportional to the frequency. So the higher the frequency, the shorter the wavelength. In examples here, we do have some ionizing radiation. That would be like X-rays, for example. But most things are going to fall in the non-ionizing stage. So you're probably familiar with some of these devices or lines of communication, such as AM/FM radio, Wi-Fi, and microwaves. Wi-Fi and microwaves, we'll point out later, run on near each other and near the same frequency, so you might have interference in between those two. But here are some examples of how those work. So let's talk about some of the names or categories that we pointed out earlier. Technically, RF, or radio frequency, is 1 to 3 gigahertz. But in this conversation, we're going to be using it for everything, including microwave frequency and millimeter frequency. This is because a lot of the things that we interact with fall within these bands, and it's just easier to name it as RF for this presentation. So radio frequencies are measured in units called hertz, which is the number of cycles per second. So again, when we have more cycles per second, the more hertz we have. And then bandwidth is the range of frequencies that the range that a signal occupies. So let's dive into this chart, which is probably hard to see. So I'm going to zoom in here on a second. But the United States actually has allocated bands for radio frequencies, specific purposes of what those are and what can be done on them. There are specifics that are reserved, so for government use only, or for specific purposes. There are some for amateur radio, or if you're familiar with ham radio, that spectrum would belong to it. Let's zoom in just a little bit here. Now we're looking at the 300 hertz spectrum going up, and you can see hopefully on the screen that there are different purposes for each. So as we go up, it goes from things like fixed and mobile all the way to radio location, and then at the end, aeronautical. There are a lot of aeronautical purposes in radio frequencies. So here's some examples you're probably more familiar with, and we're going to be discussing the ones on the left, kind of keeping the ones on the right out of scope for this. So we're going to be talking about RFID, NFC, obviously Wi-Fi, cell networks, and particularly 5G. Now, some cell network conversations are left out of scope for here. That's just because it could be its own talk by itself. And there's a lot to go on there, but we are going to be talking about 5th generation in a little bit. And as I pointed out earlier, and you might want to take a note, Bluetooth and Wi-Fi are similar to microwave ovens. So that's why you get interference between the two. There are a lot of things on the 2.4 gigahertz spectrum. And as we pointed out earlier, the lower the frequency, the longer the wavelength. And this is actually why 2.4 gigahertz Wi-Fi has a longer range than 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi before signal is lost. And again, that does have to do with the assumption that they have the same power associated. Obviously, if the powers are different, then you'll get different signal strength. So moving on, we have RFID and NFC to start. Now, one of the reasons I presented this talk in the first place was because there are particular misconceptions between RFID, NFC, and tracking. But to understand that, we first need to go into what types of frequencies there are. So we have low, high, and ultra high frequency and for RFID. And for a lot of these, they have specific purposes. So low frequency is going to be like your car key fobs, chips for your pets to identify them. High frequency is going to be things like payment and data transfer. So your cell phone, for example, when it does Google or Apple Pay, or maybe does data sharing in between the two, like the tapping together contact sharing. And then high frequency is going to be supply chain and retail inventory tracking mostly. For NFC, it stands for near field connection, and the near field is pretty literal, up to 4 centimeters distance. And as we talked about earlier, there were those radio bands that had certain licenses and purposes. So this is 13.56 megahertz, and it is globally available as an unlicensed radio frequency band. So in that spectrum, NFC can do a lot, and it is unlicensed. So we're going to get into the tracking conversation, and I just want to preface this by keeping an open mind. Maybe there are some purposes that you haven't considered before, and I'll be having plenty of sources at the bottom if you're curious as to where some of these things came from. So we're going to have, again, a very limited discussion about cellular, but if you're not familiar, your phone knows where you are. It has to, from your carrier, to be able to connect it to the closest tower. There are different types of trilateration and methods to be able to determine a location via cellular, but it should be kind of obvious that these devices are tracked if you are familiar with this field. I thought something was very particularly interesting with this. A very modern cell phone, the Google Pixel 8 and 8 Pro, actually have the ability to, for a limited time, a few hours after it's lost battery or been turned off, still be found with Find My Device. I've looked into this to try to figure out how or why it's able to track a phone after the battery is drained. But Google has not specifically said. You do have to opt into this in order for it to work, so have no fear. But if you have these devices, maybe take a look at that. So let's go back to RFID. And these are mostly key fobs, door badges, things of the sort. And they have 2 types. They have active and passive key fobs. So active will have a battery that will dry out after a certain number of years. And passive has no battery or lifetime use. So there are some applications that these passive tags have their purpose, and then active tags have their purpose. Active tags only need a few readers to be required for tracking because it's powered, the range is longer, so it needs less readers. But if you are going to be using some sort of tracking with passive tags, it would require a much larger amount of readers for tracking, especially because the range of passive is much shorter. I know it says 1 to 5 meters here, but in my experience, it's much closer to half a meter to 2 meters. I've never successfully seen passive RFID at 5 meters, for example. So again, the tracking conversation came up from the use of microchips in humans. This is not some sort of conspiracy with vaccines or anything. This is people who elect to have biomodification and have chips. I bring this conversation up a few times, and the thing that I get the most is, well, can't people track you if you get a chip? So the implant will not do that. The answer is no, for a couple of reasons. We just talked about the passive RFID. This is below your flesh, so there is a lot of interference. And again, the range is much, much, much shorter. So these don't realistically pose a threat. Neither do NFC. The one on the image is the NFC, and its range is so short that the 4 centimeters is realistically 1 centimeter or less. So RFID can be used in tracking, but there's a lot of caveats. One, it's not used as much in the wild. It is used for supply chain and inventory, which we'll get to, shopping and shipping as well, but not your standard coffee shop or gathering area will have a lot of this. There are range limitations, and most RFID tags are passive, so they need that power to be read, right? And that makes it a very difficult challenge. There are some security measures with RFID, such as encryption, mutual authentication, and kill commands. Most of the time, when you receive an RFID tag from a supply chain, like a store, you're going to have that checkout actually do a kill command on the RFID tag in the item, and then it is dead. So it is not tracking you when you get home or being used for any of those purposes. So the question really comes up when I'm talking about RFID security. You need to be much more worried about badge cloning over tracking. Badges presumably have a reason, a security focus to be present. For example, it's used in office buildings quite frequently instead of the use of metal keys for management. So it's more important to be able to keep the integrity of that key fob instead of worrying about it tracking you. And if you are worried about this, consider who gave you the card in the first place. What would be their purpose? Probably nothing. It's maybe your employer or a smart device in your home. So it's not likely to be a threat actor for you. So I did mention that supply chains and inventory frequently use RFID. And these are so that they can be tagged, categorized together, put together in a warehouse, and then maybe used for some sort of automation. So large quantities can be read at one time, and movement is tracked in relation to the stationary mount. So the mounts are screwed into the wall or poles within the room and have a purpose to be reading those specific RFID tags. So here's an example of what it might look like in a supply chain and warehouse solution. We have things like scan guns to be able to read RFID tags, the mounted RFID readers, and then applications like uses in heavy machinery items and different forms of tracking. So here, RFID tracking is actually pretty common and is an acceptable use. Bluetooth is also on the 2.4 gigahertz spectrum, and it is used for tracking pretty much on purpose. Maybe not so for your headphones or your AirPods, but definitely for tiles and AirTags. These are specifically meant to be tracked so we can find an item. Their range accuracy is about 5 meters, so pretty short. You do need to be within range of the Bluetooth device, particularly these because they're Bluetooth low energy and don't have a powered way to increase signal strength. So yes, Bluetooth can track you and pretty much on purpose. So let's talk about Wi-Fi, probably the centerpiece of this conversation. So let's just break the ice. Wi-Fi surveillance can be used to track your location, your behavior in said locations. It can see through walls, so you don't need to be able to see the access point for this to work. And it's not very much detectable by the average person. You could build your own hardware and detection for this. It is possible, but not for the average consumer. Your receiver could be what's tracked, which is presumably your phone or maybe another Wi-Fi device, or it could be you. Now, I'm going to be giving some specific examples using QR codes. I am not trying to QR fish you. If you'd like, you can look up the title of the surveys and studies as well and be able to find them for yourself. So the first one we're talking about is this study that was done capturing the human figure through a wall. So in this image on the left, you have the actual built device using Wi-Fi to cast into the room next to it. And it provides this sort of heat map. Now, it's not very accurate. It doesn't look, it looks like a human, right? But it doesn't look like a specific human. But it can know a person is behind the wall. It could detect handwriting. So in this instance, they were able to detect the hand motion on a piece of paper to be able to determine what was written. And then it can also determine how a person is moving behind the wall. Now, this one might not be scary, but this one, Dispels, has taken that to the next level. The authors say that it should be used as an alternative to LiDAR and cameras, actually asserting that this is a privacy win, because if we can replace cameras with this Wi-Fi detection, we will be removing critical pieces of information like one's face, personally identifiable information, pseudo-anonymizing the people that are being scanned. So it is a privacy win for the authors instead of considering it a more dangerous type of surveillance. And this is what that looks like. So these human figures are much more distinct. You're able to note that someone has their finger out or is standing in a specific position. And you're also able to tell people at a distance. So there's actually 4 people in the top picture, and we're able to see the bodies of those as well. So that's what it looks like. Now, there are specific Wi-Fi positioning systems. I've noticed that it's WPS or WFPS, so I've just put down both here. And these systems are used to access and track your location when you enter stores, particularly multinational brands. So in this instance, consumers have presumably a Wi-Fi device, like their phone, and they are walking around the store and stopping at locations. So maybe they're looking at a particular item, or they're watching a short advertisement. In retail environments, this is used to optimize the store layout and position of items where people are stopping for the most interest, things like that. It's using RTLS, which is real-time location system. This can also be used in healthcare for Wi-Fi-enabled medical equipment and to monitor patient movement. These applications depend on acceptance and adoption, but they are used frequently. So a measure of this is called RSSI, or Received Signal Strength Indicator, and it uses the decibel to determine the width away or how far an item is. So your phone is actually able to see much more Wi-Fi than it presents to you in your settings. It removes some of these because it might be closer to 90 decibels or something completely unusable, where 30 decibels, that signal strength is very high and is optimal for connection. So you'll see that in your settings. So Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, Zigbee, they all use RSSI. Bluetooth, again, being used for tracking on purpose, will use the RSSI to determine how close you are to your tracked tile or AirTag. And it does have a lack of sync or time stamping. So it is not perfect. It cannot be used in in-depth ways to track someone, but there are other methods that can do this. So here are some of those Wi-Fi positioning techniques that can be used. So we talked about RSSI, use that concept with multi-trilateration. So we're able to take multiple sources, receive the signal strengths from each, and determine where the location of the device is by how close it is or far away it is from multiple points of reference. So that's able to be used, but there are a couple more efficient ways or more accurate ways, like angle of arrival, which refers to the direction in which a received signal was transmitted. So by using an antenna array, the direction of the incoming signal can be determined, allowing for trilateration of the signal's source position. So an example would be determining the direction of an incoming aircraft, right? We have MIMO noted with it, which is the technology that this uses. So it is using multiple antennas, both of the transmitter and the receiver, to improve communication with each other. That's why it's known as multiple input, multiple output, or MIMO. An example of MIMO is modern Wi-Fi routers and cellular networks. So that's pretty accurate to what we've been discussing in this scope. And then we have time of flight, which hopefully you can see the little diagram on the right. But it's actually measuring the time it takes for a signal to travel from the transmitter to the receiver. In a very crude way, you can think about this as echolocation. It's very similar to how these work. However, time of flight is particularly used with LiDAR systems instead of like Wi-Fi and cellular. This is a really interesting privacy conversation. And one thing I wanted to bring up in our talk today was Commonwealth versus Duncan's. Duncan's was a student at a university. Plot twists, or maybe a spoiler here, he is not the hero of this conversation. He broke into a dorm as posing as a police officer and stole items. This court case is played out. This is not alleged. This is what's documented for the court case. And they were trying to attribute the attack to Duncan's. One thing that happened was his phone automatically connected to one of the wireless access points of the dorm. This was not his dorm, so they could rule him out from all the people who lived there. The ACLU was fighting this under the Fourth Amendment, saying that someone's device connecting to Wi-Fi should be considered a reasonable privacy of right and therefore deserve protection. So the fact that your device connected to another access point should be private and not known for certain investigations. Well, he's not the hero in our story. He did do it, not a great thing. But what they were able to determine, or the opinion from the Supreme Court, was that the student relinquished his expectation of privacy, one, when he agreed to use the university's services as a user, but also just how the basics of registration and connecting to internet work. It's almost impossible to say, hey, if we didn't have this, or if it wasn't logged, then we couldn't have it. That's great, but it is logged. It's very easily ascertained. And again, usually you give this up as a user for a network or a specific location, application. It can extend all the way to devices that you have. So you're kind of giving that up. So they relinquish that expectation of privacy. It is not a right. So now let's get into the fun part. If you thought the first part was fun, you'll definitely like this. We're going to be answering if cellular 5th generation or 5G cellular spectrum, what it's all about. And then we're going to say, does it track you and cause harm, specifically cause harm? So when looking at this and doing some research, I found that there was a purpose for this antagonization of 5G. You can sell product with it. An example is these stickers that attach to your devices that are supposed to absorb radiation into it so that less radiation comes to you. I guess that means it'll interfere with the ability for your radios to communicate appropriately, but that would assume that these devices actually work. Deborah Davis supports these, and it's really hard to see in the small corner of this image, but she's the one supporting these devices. She's the founder of and president of Environmental Health Trust. And she's one of the leaders that is very anti 5G. And she's filed many lawsuits against the FCC. But these claims have more severe impact. The Environmental Health Trust has had other leaders that have had some specific claims against 5G, that it is actually a military technology that affects your brain. This makes it very hard to take the argument seriously. When having the conversation about anti 5G, it's very hard to come at it without this flavor of intent. So that's pretty interesting. However, once 5G started to be recognized within the public and the fear started spreading, organizations like this made more revenue. So I thought that was pretty interesting. These are not the only people who claim that 5G is a problem or a hazard to our health. I bring this up because I didn't want to make it seem like, oh, it's just the neighbor down the street who doesn't believe in 5G. These are published authors and people of high importance that have these beliefs. So there are two books for criticism that I'd like to point out specifically here, EMF'd and Overpowered, which both talk about 5G and Wi-Fi and cell phones and what you can do to protect yourself against them. And come to find out that the authors of these are questionable, such as Dr. Joseph Mercola. His previous publishing experience has been in keto and diets and things like that, and more general health instead of specifically about technology, more of that general health and wellness. Whereas Martin Blank, his reviews for these books are not that great either. While it may be hard to see on the screen, we have criticism from a couple different people saying that, is he really a doctor? Has this been reviewed professionally? Is it of concrete evidence? And the answers to some of these are no. Now, I would be remiss to tell you that these books have very positive ratings on Amazon as well. Kind of, if you look at the reviews, it's more of an echo chamber. Where these examples are more solid in pointing out that it might be not backed with all fact. And we have the same for here, the second book. We have some interesting reviews and what other people have been saying. So the top one is asking, what does the National Cancer Institute say? Pointing out that other areas of authority have basically said this is not a problem. And that this is a way to strike fear into others or maybe cause panic. Now, I thought this was pretty interesting. This device is supposed to be used. It is recommended in these books. It is like a light switch for your Wi-Fi. Personally, it would be interesting to have a Wi-Fi timer of 8 hours, and at the end of the day, the Wi-Fi is off and you don't have to deal with it anymore. Sounds like a nice reprieve from reality. But here it is supposed to be able to disable Wi-Fi access points to decrease the amount of RF radiation in your home. And again, remember, there are non-ionizing and ionizing radiation. Wi-Fi and what we're talking about is non-ionizing. So what are we arguing about, or what are the problems that they present? They say they present thermal effects, right? So there are many ways to mitigate thermal effects. These books will recommend things like putting a pillow in between your lap and your laptop to reduce the wavelength's power so that the thermal effects are less. We'll see some devices and products that are fueled by this here later in the presentation. But the FDA does not agree. It does say that if there is a risk, it is so extremely low compared to natural instances and how one would normally incur disease that it is not necessarily a risk at all. You're more likely to get a cold or have controllable risk factors that would lead to harm, such as smoking or something like that, how that can get you sick. But the FDA says that the risk is so low, you're more likely to be impacted by something else. So, but in studies that have been conducted, there isn't a risk present to humans. Now, I have here someone text the FCC because one of the recommendations in the books is to do texting over calling, as that lets off less radiation. So, and they measure that by SAR, or the specific absorption rate. So SAR can vary on condition. It is not consistent while testing. So you can test a device at different times, and the same device will have a different SAR rating. So it cannot reliably be compared to each other. We can't really say that a SAR of X is going to be more dangerous than a SAR of Y. It's just bigger is badder is what they assume. All cell phones do meet the FCC's SAR guidelines that are sold here in the United States. So again, the FCC has claimed that these are a safe measure of the absorption rate. So is 5G able to track you? We talked about it before. Your cell phone is able to track you. It shouldn't be that much of a surprise. So 5G is actually tracking the cell phone. It is not hacking you. It is not making some of the claims that these authors are asserting. And there is something that is very different between a device being trackable and something actively tracking you. You can leave your phone at home. That is your choice. So it's the device itself, not you. There's not a way for 5G to be able to identify who you are. And it's not like dispels from the sky. We don't have big satellites that are able to determine who we are via cellular connection in that way. So we're going to talk about a few of the things that you can do now. And one of these is automatic, which is the randomization of MAC addresses. So specifically for Bluetooth, this is a concern. You want your MAC address to be randomly rotated so that it's not easily tracked or found, except in tracking purposes, again, specifically like tiles and AirTags. These happen automatically depending on what operating system you're using. But if you're using any of these or more current operating systems, this happens automatically. It assigns a locally administered MAC address, so an LAA, to be able to randomly rotate. It'll keep the first part of the MAC address, or the OUI, intact, which gives it an idea of what the device is. So if the OUI is registered, other devices are able to ascertain what kind of device it's connecting to. Here on the right, we have a screenshot from a phone that is running Wiggle Wi-Fi. It is displaying different MAC addresses of different Bluetooth devices. And you can see on the right, it's able to determine what type of device it is. So there are multiple uses for this. If you're more interested in Wiggle, wigle.net, I would take a look at it. It's very interesting. So there are some other devices as well. Is this a conspiracy or a commercial product? We have some shielding devices like this large one here. Out of all the examples presented, this is the closest thing you're going to get to an accurate shielding device. Something very thick and large and unwieldy, not like the little pouches for phones you may see in schools, right? So these products are the type that we're looking at. It was studied in this study by Eric Katz of Purdue University. You can take a look at this, research yourself. But basically, of all of the devices, the large box we just saw still let in one SMS message. It was able to receive a text. But for most of the devices that were registered, these smaller devices, pouches, fabrics, things like that, were still able to receive text messages from other devices while in the Faraday device. So it did not successfully block signal, and it did not work. Cellular connection was still achieved. Here are some commercial products that are sold as protection against Wi-Fi or 5G. And I'd like to point some criticism here. One, this item is over $800. There is a profit or motive to be made by having this fear. And I see some challenges with it. One, it's porous. Two, I guess radiation goes through walls, but not floors. So what about the below the bed to the top of the bed? So that is pretty interesting and a flaw in logic there. As we talked about with Eric Katz's study, a lot of the devices do not work. So these Faraday fabrics that are very easily sewn and used are basically useless. They cannot perform in the way that they describe. And on the right, we have a 5G absorption bar necklace that pretends that it may absorb all the harmful radiation around you and protect you like a little bubble because you're wearing it. And then again, the same logic with the bed shield. I don't really understand the concept of protecting your like forehead and back of the head, but your face is still exposed. So I guess Wi-Fi and RF just magically don't target your face. That's not how radio frequencies work. So this product is also at a loss. But what can you do about it? Okay, what is your threat matrix? Let's establish that first. If you're afraid of being tracked, ask why, who, when, where, what's their motive, what will happen, things like that. Is there a reason for you to be tracked? Probably not. You're probably not committing bank heists and big crime where someone would want to do that in the first place. But again, your cellular provider obviously has the location of your cell phone. So if you have a cell phone, you are probably being tracked in some way, but you are consenting to that to use the device. There's no way for a cellular provider to be able to give you service without knowing where or approximately where the device is. So if you care, turn off services when you aren't using them. This goes for Bluetooth. If you're concerned about your Bluetooth broadcasting, then turn it off. Your NFC tag is very low risk. You've already been in Wi-Fi positioning system spaces like warehouses and retail stores. You've already been there. What threat have they posed you before? What threat are they now? If you care, also disable auto connect in your network preferences. This will be for your phones and different devices, which can also help protect you. To the right is some poor advice. It is not advice I'm giving you. It is an example from the other side, saying things like send a text instead of calling or different measures to reduce the radiation and its thermal effects. But as a reminder, RF is everywhere. It's not really possible unless you're in the middle of nowhere with no cell service, no AM, FM radio, no nothing. It's not really possible to escape RF. So I really appreciate you coming to this live stream. It's been fun. I really appreciate your patience. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them now. And if you don't have any questions, you can enjoy this amusing slide of good and bad Wi-Fi name choices that I have seen. So if those interest you, you can determine which ones are bad and which ones are good. FBI surveillance van is definitely my pet peeve. I am aware that Wi-Fi SSIDs can have spaces in them, but this just looks more Wi-Fi. But I dislike that one very much. Land of the free, home of the wave is definitely the winner. Okay. Well, again, thank you for your patience and thank you for visiting today. And if you do have any questions, we can hang on for a little bit and receive them. Otherwise, I appreciate you and thank you for joining.